Remember that bit in Super Mario 64 when you get to the bottom of the hazy maze cave and there's just a dinosaur down there? And little kid you was all like, yo, what the frick, how is there a dinosaur down here? And the dinosaurs all like, yo, I do be vibing though. And you're all like, safe. And then the dinosaur was like, safe. Especially if you found it before tackling the star that directly involves it. Do you remember how special and how magical this discovery felt? Yeah, well, I don't, because I wasn't a spoilt Nintendo fan growing up like you. I grew up with the PS1, Crash, Spyro, Rayman and so on, and while in the years since I've definitely become more of a loyalist for my Japanese dads who still think the internet is something you use to catch really big fish, there's something that lifelong Nintendo fans need to reconcile with themselves, and that's that there is such a thing as a fate worse than death. Cry all you want about F-Zero's radio silence or the lack of new Pikmin games, and then look at this picture of Spyro in the 2010s. Look at Spyro and apologise. There is such a thing as having your rotting corpse reanimated and puppeteered by the malevolent marionettes of the industry alongside a horde of bootleg Chinese Monsters Inc. knockoffs. This one's called Drill Sergeant. Fuck off. The old adage decrees that you have to be careful what you wish for. We thought we wanted Crash, Spyro, Rayman and others to live forever, but it seems that our wishes were granted by that douchebag genie from Fairly Odd Parents. No, I said the genie. Our desires were twisted. We sat through mediocre release after mediocre release, over half a decade of these pricks. David Spade Sparks and fucking Voodoo. Now, granted, Crash had it a little less rough than these other two franchises did. He basically had a bunch of forgettable games that you could describe as alright if you were being very optimistic. No hideous redesigns, no obnoxious mascots hijacking everything. Granted, he did have this.
Crash, I really am cross with you. I'm just trying to do my job, and you go and cause all this chaos. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to eat your face. Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. I wish some sort of reconciliation was possible here. And frankly, I'm still mad about the last game. You didn't even invite me. That really hurt.
But so much of it just felt so lifeless, like a cash-in just using the IP to get people's attention. When Crash 4 was leaked, not announced but leaked, I had mixed emotions. On one hand, I was very excited, but more so than that, I was angrily anxious. Rumours about Crash 4 have circled for decades at this point, and obviously never true. We've all been burned before, right? When Sean Layden walked on stage at E3 2016 with the Crash main theme blaring and Crash's silhouette walking behind him, I really thought that was finally it. And obviously it turned out to be the Insane trilogy, which, hey, I'm not going to complain about. It was pretty cool and I quite enjoyed it. But what I really wanted is what I've always wanted. Something new and something good. I was frankly getting impatient. No more remakes, no more remasters, no more whispers or rumours or fake leaks. Just give me fucking Crash 4 already. And now here it is. And frankly, I think it's come a bit too late. Had it come like 5 or maybe even 10 years sooner, I'd be able to get really excited about it, but better late than never, of course. I am still very excited and honestly very relieved that it's finally here. The existence of Crash 4 poses an interesting question. How do you make a direct sequel to something 22 years later? If you're Gabe Newell, for example, then your answer is probably to swan dive headfirst out of the nearest open window. But if you're Toys for Bob, the answer is really quite well. It's about time to look into things. And how much you want me to do that again? Too much? Too much? Okay, alright, go on then. It's definitely the 90s again. Crash Bandicoot is back on our PlayStations. Technology is bringing about a wave of universal existential dread, and I just shit myself and promptly cried about it. As its name suggests, Crash 4 is a game that, in my opinion, exists in multiple time periods, namely the 90s and present day. What I mean by this is that in so many ways, Crash 4 feels like the modernization that the series has desperately been drop-calling the industry for so long. The gameplay, level design, and difficulty scaling have evolved so appropriately in ways that I'm going to fawn over a lot over the course of this video, and Crash's sense of control, much like one of the most commonly used adjectives for something vaguely considered cool around his time, is tight. Coming up with flaws in Crash 4's core gameplay might take some time. Thankfully, we have time, since we're sat here at this loading screen. So, how was your day? Unfortunately, I have not pulled off any editing trickery here. This is actually the loading screen. This is just about every loading screen in the game. It's a still image with no music, and on the standard PS4 on which I'm playing, it takes a very long time. And now comes the basic premise of this video. In terms of core gameplay, which, let me make clear, is what matters the most, Crash 4 is firmly in 2020. I've complained a lot before about the state of 3D platformers in the modern day. The few that exist feel so unfocused and unconcerned with 3D platforming. They'd much rather throw silly gimmicks at you than actually commit to the idea of precise platforming in a 3D space. But Crash 4 is the most focused 3D platformer to come out since Super Mario Galaxy, which I only started 2 weeks ago. Thanks, by the way, Nintendo. I'm broke now. See this? This right here is the shit I want. It's as simple as this. Not this, or this, or this! I just want to jump on shit and feel good about it. If you take away one quote from this video, let it be this. Crash 4 lets you jump on shit. The level design and theming is constantly creative. One of my favourite parts in the whole game is from the level I just showed you, a level called Run It By You, which is one of my favourite levels in the whole game, where you end up doing this side-scrolling platforming section whilst riding on top of a food truck boat. Granted, it's an example of 2D platforming, but it's to show you how wacky and creative this game gets. Jetboard sections aside, this level is also full of dope, satisfying 3D platforming, much like the rest of the game. There's a level late in the game called Crash Landed, which is just one of the most bonkers things the series has ever done. The vehicle sections and other stuff still exist, but they're so minimal and generally harmless compared to something like, say, Crash 3. This game is just full of awesome ideas, and they all serve the purpose of platforming. The new masks provide additional layers and create some genuinely mind-bending platforming puzzles at times, especially in the later levels. This stuff gets crazy. My personal favourite is the Dark Matter mask, which lets you gain height, hover and descend with your spin, much like one of the late game power-ups in Warped. I love this thing because of how nice it feels to use, but also because of its big dumb grumpy face. You will find yourself clearing crazy distance with this thing, unlike anything you've ever seen in a Crash game before. The levels are focused yet open, with occasional opportunity for non-linear progression, and much like our frowns, they're a lot longer and harder than they were in 1998. I'm so used to being babied by platformers that it's refreshing to see a game realise the potential of its ideas and throw some genuinely crazy, hard but interesting level design at you on the critical path. Maybe some of the young'uns, who are likely a part of the target audience for this game, might have trouble with it, but hey, fuck them kids. You've got Fortnite, we've been waiting 20 years for this. However, as much as Crash's gameplay and design has progressed to fit the modern era, and I'll talk some more about how it's done so in a bit, my one main criticism with this game is how, in a lot of ways, its presentation hasn't. Its presentation, in my opinion, is largely stuck in the 90s, and when I say this, I'm not referring to the visual style. I think the game looks absolutely gorgeous. I love how detailed the environments and backgrounds are, but take the loading screen for example. A still image with no music or sound effects whatsoever that takes way too long, that ain't very 2020. The Crash Insane trilogy loading screens weren't much to write home about, but at least you had a little moving Aku Aku on there and some randomized hints. Hell, Dragon Ball Z Budokai 2 came out in 2003, and when I played it with my friends as a kid, that game's loading screen blew my mind. It's really simple. You wiggle the control stick as fast as humanly possible, and it makes Master Roshi spin depending on how fast you're going. Aside from that, it was incredibly blank, but couldn't there at least be something like that? Like a little spinny guy to play around with while I wait? I'll tell you who the spinny guy is. He's right there. Hire me. I've been beating around the bush for a while on this point, but I'm just gonna say it. I don't think Crash 4's soundtrack is very good. I don't like saying stuff like this because I have no qualifications in or any real theoretical knowledge of this topic, outside of being able to pop a few Outkast songs out on acoustic guitar whenever I'm feeling sad, which is to say that if my neighbours hear Miss Jackson one more time, they might just call the police on me. But I feel like Crash as a series has always gone for something very different in its soundtracks. Its contemporaries like Mario and Spyro go for very traditional tracks that are in the foreground of every level. They're noticeable, they're explicit, and they have a real sense of progression and melody. They have a beginning, middle and end and so on. And Crash, on the other hand, especially in the first two games, has a far more subtle thing going on. Lots of environmental noises or ambience, as if the games are trying to give you far more of a sense of place than mood. I respect what it's going for, but it's just never really done anything for me, and I don't know if I feel like it particularly works in these games. In Crash 1, sure, because it's all bound to one setting, but in the later games, Crash 4 included, when you're hopping around dimensions and between time and space, I'd like to hear a bit of that subtle goofiness thrown out in favour of a bit more melodic goofiness. Breath of the Wild is a great example of a game that's very minimalistic with its music. It puts its music in the background of the game, and I think it totally works for that game because it's bound to one setting and the game can't possibly know what pace you're tackling it at, so there's no point in trying to create a comprehensive soundtrack that would cater to that. Crash is far more frenetic and its pace is far more dictated, so in the main series platformers, I'd like to hear stuff more like what we get in CTR or Crash Twinsanity. CTR for my money has by far the best soundtrack in the series. I guess the question I want to ask is how many of the songs from Crash 4 got stuck in your head, especially compared to other similar games? Do you think you could hum any of them? Because I can't even really remember what the main theme sounds like, to be honest. There's a whole world of Mad Max inspired levels, for example, and it doesn't really feel like the music accurately represents those themes. I was going through the level Offbeat, this super vibrant and colourful level clearly based off a Mardi Gras party, and while the song was fitting, I couldn't help but notice how repetitive and kind of generic it sounded. There's a lot of levels based on feudal Japan, and while I could recognise traditional Japanese instruments being used, I didn't really get much more out of it than that. The music felt very flat and unambitious, perhaps too subtle. Of course, like I say, I'm not exactly qualified and I don't really like criticising something like this because I have little knowledge of it. There's certainly a lot of cool things I noticed too. A lot of Cortex's levels have little nods to his old boss themes worked in there. About 30 seconds into the level Give It a Spin, there's a sequence of notes that sounds suspiciously similar to the beginning of Temple Ruins and Jaws of Darkness from Crash 1, which, if intentional, is really neat. And there's a few songs like Nitro Processing and Out for Launch that I really liked. I just know that about a year ago I played Yooka-Laylee in the Impossible Lair, a game that while I loved, clearly had many budgetary issues, but man, I can remember so many songs from that game regardless. So many of them are stuck in my head, and Crash 4's music, in a very general sense to me, feels quite dated by comparison. And I had more trouble compiling music for this video than I have for just about any other video I've made before. Perhaps, however, the soundtrack is simply not being done justice by this game's audio balancing. Am I crazy in thinking that the music in this game is way quieter than the sound effects and voice acting? I feel like I had to have my TV up way louder to really get a sense of the game's music than I have for just about any other game on my PS4. I also discovered a couple of glitches here and there. When trying to complete the bonus route for the level Dragging On, I hit a wall and had to look up a tutorial online. I found this video by Crystal Fisher where, in order to complete the room, he does this. Everyone in the comments seems confused as to how he pulled this off, and when questioned about it, he seems just as confused as anyone else, thinking that it was actually the only way to beat the room. In the level Nitro Processing, when going upside down and past a death zone with Aku Aku, I ascended to Nirvana. I haven't seen Buddha yet, but I will try and get a chat with him. The long and short of it is that Crash 4, in my opinion, has some presentation issues that make it feel a bit dated and nostalgic in maybe some of the wrong ways. There was also a fair few frame rate drops here and there, especially between cutscenes, and the way that the hub world music starts up before the loading screen finishes and the world loads in this kind of clunky fashion suggests a slight lack of polish in some of the more trivial areas, but they're exactly that. Trivial. They don't really impact the core experience, divine softlocks aside, and I only really bring them up for the sake of an overarching point I'll be making soon. See, I've spent a lot of time talking about presentation in this video because during my adolescence, as the PS2 and GameCube became the PS3 and Wii, and the Xbox 360 was doing pretty well itself, I often asked myself this one question: what happened to 3D platformers? Where have all the games that are like the ones I played in my childhood gone? What happened to Crash and Spyro and Rayman? And the most common answer I'd get from looking it up online or talking to other people was simply that they were outdated now, and they just couldn't thrive in the industry. And I always struggled to accept that answer. Why are they outdated? Because some prominent series in the genre have had a few bad games? Why can't people just make more good ones? In the present day, I think that's a far more reasonable answer. How could games so arcadey and juvenile stand next to these cinematic open world juggernauts? These absolutely monolithic AAA work-life balance destroyers. Here's an unrelated picture of Crunch. But in the mid-2000s? I mean, sure, Kratos was coming along to slice a guy's dick off and stab another guy with it, and his Master Chief to go back in time and stop Skynet or whatever the fuck it is he does. But I don't think video games were quite yet at that unattainable point that comparatively smaller and more focused games couldn't compete with them. And so when I played Crash 4, when I've played almost any 3D platformer in the last few years, I've thought about this question: what happened to 3D platformers? And it's when I look at the lack of focus of games like Yooka-Laylee and Mario Odyssey, and I look at the flat title and loading screens and comparative lack of cinematic value of games like Crash 4, that I see the bones of a genre that, yeah, maybe justifiably became less sought after as the years went on. And that's where Crash 4 goes on to be brilliant. See, whilst 3D platformers have slowly lost relevance, 2D platformers have thrived, mostly due to the rise of indie games and the fact that 2D games are obviously much easier to make than 3D. Something that 2D platformers can also do very reliably is remix and rehash old content in creative ways to create the illusion of more content, because it basically is more content. Think the B and C sides from Celeste or the invasion levels in Rayman Legends. Remixes of pre-existing levels that provide the player with extra challenges without the time or budget needed to make entirely new assets for whole new levels. One of the other problems platformers face in the modern day is the sheer level of content. Look at a game like GTA 5 and compare it to Tropical Freeze. They're not actually really comparable, are they? So Crash 4 takes a trick from its 2D brethren and introduces the inverted levels, basically wacky backwards versions of pre-existing levels. There's even inverted boss fights. In a pretty brilliant move to keep up with the industry, it's introduced skins, which are currently free until Activision decide to pull another epic meme on us. I use Balloon Crash because, I mean, look. Crash 4 has an extremely impressive level of content in it. Just the amount of levels alone was pretty surprising to me at first, but then you add in the inverted levels, you add in the flashback tapes, and all the cool cosmetics and unlockables and achievements, and you have the first 3D platformer in years that's felt truly justified in releasing at full price. There's one other 3D platformer that comes to mind that's done something a bit like the inverted levels. They're called Prankster Comets, and they're in Super Mario Galaxy. What a coincidence. Of course, there is one key way in which I feel like perhaps Crash 4's core gameplay can also be made to feel a bit archaic. I can say with confidence that as much as I like Crash 4, and I like it a lot, I am never going to 100% this game for as long as I live. And do you want to know why? Here's why. Look, I don't like secrets in real life. Secrets in video games are usually pretty dope, but this is evil. Is it fair to say that Crash 4 might have a few too many hidden boxes? So many times I've gone into a level determined to 100% it, made it to the end confident that I've scoured every inch of it, and then been confronted with the box problem. Should I have thrown away 5 lives in pursuit of one single hidden box that may or may not have even been in this obtuse location that I vaguely believed I might have been able to jump onto, or preserved them for the sake of those 5 boxes I'd already broken between checkpoints? If it seems like I harped on about the loading screens too much in this video, then this is why. Because if you're a completionist, you're going to be seeing them a lot. You're going to make it to the end of a level, experience the agony of seeing that you only have one box missing, and then have to restart the whole thing over again. It's worse in this game than in any other Crash game before because the levels are longer, the loading screens are certainly longer, and there are more boxes hidden in outright diabolical places than ever before. Look, I like difficulty, I like a challenge, and I certainly think that people going for 100% completion should have to work hard for it. But even Spyro has a seldom talked about feature where you can click the analog stick to make sparks point in the vague direction of any gems you haven't collected yet. It's rarely, if ever, mentioned in the games, and it doesn't hand things to you on a silver platter, but it's there as a failsafe to avoid things getting frustrating and tedious. Crash unfortunately doesn't have something like that, and so sadly I don't think it quite hits the difficulty to frustration ratio very well in that regard. I think it'd go a long way to have a quality of life feature, like maybe using the time mask to rewind back to wherever you want during your run so that you can look for any missing boxes. Boxes broken between that point and where you currently are wouldn't carry over, but lives lost would, as a penalty for overusing it and making mistakes. I don't know how feasible it would be to program, but other games have made similar stuff work before, so just an idea. It'd certainly be better than the current level of tedium involved in getting to the end and realising you've missed one. It's this that stands as the last monument to that archaic 90s gameplay that kinda makes me understand how these games went out of fashion. Oh, well, maybe the other playable characters as well. They're fine, I've certainly seen worse, but none of them are as fun to play as Crash in my opinion. Dingodile really close to being really cool, though maybe this is my personal bias talking because I love him. But I find his hover really sensitive, like almost every time I push the X button even slightly too hard on a jump, he automatically hovers and then I end up dying because of it, and it makes him really finicky to control sometimes. Is that just me? Torna's kinda neat, but the wall jump mechanic works in a really weird kinda awkward way, and the grappling hook, while cool in concept, is actually a bit harder to use than it needs to be because of the game's depth perception, which by the way in this game will very frequently become death perception. Though the little yellow circle below your character that shows where they're about to land is very nice. And Cortex is whatever. They don't actively take away from the game like additional characters in a lot of 3D platformers do, but it does kind of feel like one of those 3D platformer tropes just kind of brought into the game because that's what 3D platformers have always done. It is nice to have a bit of variety, but it also does mess with your muscle memory if you're constantly switching between the other characters, so I just did like every level of every separate character in one go because I didn't want to have to deal with the frustration of constantly getting used to new movesets. Crash 4 is a game that, in a few areas, still seems stuck in the 90s, and it makes me wonder if some of these are just 3D platformer things that the genre will never be able to shake off. And the main reason it makes me wonder these things is because in so many other areas, and in so many of the more important areas, Crash shakes off the cobwebs. It learns from the games that are relevant today and has a clear understanding of the modern state of the industry. If you're trying to make a 3D platformer today, this is the game you should use as your framework. Curb some of the tedium and maybe spruce up your loading and menus a bit, but more importantly, focus on the platforming. Remix some pre-existing levels to save on making new assets if you have to. It's a trend, sure, but there's nothing wrong with it. And of course, love your game and love the genre like I feel like Toys for Bob do. There's a lot of clear love and passion put into this game, from the pitch perfect characterization of the characters from the originals to so many hilarious and charming animations and the ways that it builds on the world and story of what came before it. It's an excellent sequel, and while, as I say, I do think it frankly came a bit too late, I'm very glad it exists. It's the first game in a while to make me think that maybe 3D platformers do stand a chance in the modern day. If they adapt to the industry surrounding them and embrace modernity and even learn from some of Crash 4's more minor shortcomings, who knows? I also hope this is a true return for Crash and that they haven't just paraded him out for one last nostalgia trip before they put him back in his box, his one last remaining box. Kill me. I feel like this game has shown that the fans are still willing to cash out for this series and that they still care about Crash. I think it's certainly shown that the developers still care about him. Well, despite the fact that I made a channel update less than 2 months ago, I actually have a surprising amount of things to talk about. Firstly, if you missed said channel update, then you will have missed the announcement that I've started streaming. My Twitch channel is here, so I'd recommend going and giving it a follow if you're interested in listening to me banter about in real time. I've either recently finished or I'm about to finish Rayman Origins on stream depending on when this video goes up, and once that's out of the way, I'll be starting a legitimate 100% blind playthrough of Morrowind. I know nothing about the game, only that based on what I've heard, I'm either going to love it or give up 3 streams in. I generally update people on my streams and any manner of other things through YouTube community posts, but more commonly through my Twitter, which I'll show on screen here and link in the description as always. In that same channel update, I also talked about how in September, I originally wanted to make a video spotlighting 5 small creators whom I think deserve more attention. Plans for that video were abandoned for reasons I've explained in a community post since, and in its place, I'm going to be recommending a heavily underrated channel to you now at the end of every big analysis video I make. This time, the small creator shout out goes to Toozle, one of my absolute favourites on this site. I'll link his channel in the description. If I did not make stupid videos about stupid kids games, I think I would make videos like Toozle's. The guy never fails to crack me up, and I have such an appreciation for his comedic ability. I would give special mention to the video Life of a Banana, which looks like a terrible annoying orange ripoff at first if you're just going by the thumbnail, but oh boy, it turns into so much more. If he dies with no one having ever acknowledged what an artistic masterpiece that video is, then the world is truly not fair. He's incredibly underrated, and I'll be featuring similar channels with under 5,000 subscribers at the end of my future analysis videos, so I hope you'll give these people the time of day because they really do deserve it, and making a start on YouTube and building an audience is not easy. trust me. Finally, the next episode of Fudge's Thesis is the last, or at least for the foreseeable future. Call it the end of season 1 if you will, though I just have no idea when or if there will ever be a season 2. I like to think there will be. For now, I think I have a much better series in mind to replace it that I'm very excited to get to work on in the coming months. If you like it when I say dumb shit, then I think you'll very much enjoy it. Thank you as always to my high tier patrons: Cheesy Chip, Mike Archer, Mike Craig, Captain L, Good Chicken, Chris Monk, Derek Drost, Flashing Fire, Bryce Stevens, Cousin Boneless, Tale of the Toaster, Waldington, that's my favourite one, Justin Mills, Heist Van Duren, Garm, and Super. I super appreciate you guys and all of my patrons as always. It's because of you that I feel about 15% less fear that I'll one day become broken homeless. See you next time.